There are a lot of problems in the world today, but we're going to focus on the problem in colleges and universities.
Okay. So, by proxy of me showing you the video, I'm transphobic and I caused harm and violence. So be it. I can't do anything to control that.
Okay, so that's not something that you have an issue with? The fact that that happened?
So in the past few years, we've seen an uprise of triggered trannies and safe space needing snowflakes invading college campuses all across Canada and the United States, attempting to monitor, regulate, and ultimately control the actions of the public through collectively shaming ideas and leading online harassment campaigns. Through the efforts of these social justice warriors, they've effectively created an echo chamber of ideas that have very little validity when taken outside of their philosophical context and applied to modern society. Colleges and universities have long been renowned as the birthplace of modern ideas and intellectual debate. They are synonymous with controversial studies and pushing the boundaries of philosophical analysis. The idea that any idea is too dangerous to be given a platform, debated, and then ultimately torn down is something that could only be thought of in 2017. Throughout the past few years, there's been a heightened sense of irrationality when it comes to dealing with confrontation. The current mindset seems to be that there are some subjects, such as race and IQ, or the links between biology and sex, that are so dangerous that if we were to have an intellectual conversation with them, that the results would be so damaging to people that it would ultimately do more harm than good. With this, we often see the active suppression and ultimately the silencing of ideas that don't necessarily fit the current mainstream academic agenda. You can go on YouTube and find videos of students speaking out about the absolutely disgusting ways that they've been treated for merely questioning the narrative being spewed out by these indoctrinating professors. Instead of engaging in an intellectual debate, these professors usually get hyper-emotional and enact an authoritarian rage, which consists of degrading slurs, childish behavior, and what I would consider a complete abuse of power. And these are your authority figures. These are the people that are teaching your children how to be these bigoted, self-loathing, ignorant hood rats that you see marching around in the streets with their communist flags, waving the hammer and sickle, screaming in people's faces, "Nazis go home," to anybody who's right of Karl Marx. They have no problem enacting violence to prevent certain ideas because they've been taught that emotional distress is equivalent to physical violence and therefore is justified. This belief is confirmed every time a student sees a professor shut down another student for applying any amount of critical thinking instead of opening up the conversation and tackling it head on. By shutting down the conversation, you say that the subject that's being talked about is so unbelievably demonstrable that it cannot even be spoken of. I understand that a lot of these schools are publicly funded and need to uphold a certain level of morality and ethics, such as creating a space that's free of racial, gender, or sexual discrimination. But the degree to which these schools are going to shelter these young adults from controversial subjects is borderline irresponsible. Often we see one of two things happening in schools today. The youth have been taught to embrace a culture of fear and self-loathing. They have been taught that the society that their ancestors helped build, that they grew up in and now ultimately live in, is built off of a systemically racist, homophobic, misogynist patriarchy that needs to be completely dismantled. This either leads to a boiling point of civil unrest, like we saw at Evergreen State University in Washington, where students essentially created a lynch mob, held faculty members hostage, and created an absolutely unbelievable list of demands, including pizza, while they waited for the demands to be done. All because a white professor decided to write an email voicing his opinions on a current racial issue that was happening at the school. Or we get an increased role of authoritarianism, like we just saw at Wilfred Laurier in Waterloo, Ontario. A TA by the name of Lindsay Shepherd decided to show her class a video clip of Jordan Peterson, who was a well-known professor at the University of Toronto and is now an even more well-known social figure. The debate was of a clip that aired on TVO, which is a large network here in Canada. It's literally called TV Ontario. It featured a debate between Peterson and a colleague over gender pronouns. I'll play the clip now, but I'll warn you, it's bad.
Asking us to lay the case out. What is it you find offensive about this legislation?
Well, fundamentally, there were two things that really bothered me, although there have been other things I've thought about since. One was that I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous.
What are those words?
Those are the made-up words that people now describe as gender neutral. And so, to me, they're an attempt to control language and in a direction that isn't happening organically. It's not happening naturally. People aren't picking up these words in the typical way that new words are picked up, but by force and by fiat. And I would say by force because there's legislative power behind them. So and I don't like these made-up words, Z and Zer and that sort of thing.
Okay, what about, they're not all made-up, quote-unquote made-up words. For example, they is one of them. Yeah, but we speak to an individual as they.
Right, but we can't dispense with the distinction between singular and plural.
And I want to give you the opportunity to speak to whether or not you are a transphobe.
Well, I can tell you that I've received more letters from transsexual people supporting me than opposing me. And I never said anything really about transsexual people, about their existence, although that was the first thing that I was accused of doing. I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't. And so this issue is in some sense only peripherally about transsexual issues. It's more centrally about gender issues. And then on top of that, and I think it's the biggest issue, is that it's a free speech issue.
In other words, besides man and woman, there are 29 other gender expressions. For example, pangender, queer gender, gender fluid, cross-dresser, bigendered, gender blender, and the list goes on. And Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this. You teach trans studies. So if you would, give us a brief primer on so many gender identities that in your view require non-traditional pronouns.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, when in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the histories.
Give us some of the other pronouns that one would hear, typically.
I don't focus on pronouns because pronouns are actually part of a cisnormative culture. So what we do is learn about...
Well, I'm going to stop you right there.
Yes, I was just about to explain.
Good.
So we don't start from a cisnormative perspective because that can't actually go very far.
What does cisnormative mean?
So I'm going to start us there. Cisnormative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, and then sometimes that will also recognize intersex or trans people or transsexual people, as you mentioned, because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cisnormativity. Okay. But cisnormativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case. And scientists have been doing this for at least over 50 years.
Your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true, and yet our social systems haven't been able to find a way to address the level of complexity that people actually experience.
Can I step in, Steve?
Stand by for a second, because I want to let everybody else get in first,
and
then we'll get to him.
You either, so.
And that means, and people are always looking for new tools to operate in the world. And if you invent a good tool, like a new word, then people will pick it up just as fast as they possibly can. You really see that in English. But the words that are being required now are not good tools, and that's why people aren't using them. And so instead what we have is the use of force, despite the fact that that's being denied. Although we've already established that, at least in the opinion of one of the people on this panel, I'm already guilty of a hate crime, which is what I said I was guilty of when I made that video. Steve, the issue with the law is quite straightforward. The government is requiring us to use certain language. That's not the same as not using certain language. And it's a line, and this is the fundamental issue. This is maybe the fundamental issue. That's a line we should not cross. We should not allow the government to decide which words we're allowed to use. It's a mistake. And it's a mistake that strikes right at the heart of free speech. And the thing about free speech is that it's not the right to criticize your leaders, which is what people usually characterize it as. Is freedom of speech is freedom to engage in the processes that we use to formulate the problems in our society, to generate solutions to them and reach a consensus. It's actually a mechanism. It's not just another value. And you should put constraints on free speech with the most extreme caution, because you interfere with people's ability to think and communicate.
Apparently, after multiple people complained about the viewing, Shepherd was brought before what can only be described as an Orwellian nightmarish ethics tribunal of Wilfred Laurier University. Thankfully, Lindsay Shepherd was able to secretly record some of the conversation that happened that day. Here's some of the leaked audio from what was said at that meeting.
Sorry, what did I violate in that policy?
So, gender-based violence, transphobia in that policy, causing harm to trans students by framing their identity as invalid or their pronouns as invalid.
Or something
Potentially invalid.
So I caused harm
which
and
is
violence.
under the Ontario Human Rights Code, a protected thing, and also something that Laurier holds as a value.
And why that might have been seen as problematic by some of the students, maybe even threatening?
I don't see how someone would rationally think it was threatening. I could see how it might challenge their existing ideas, but for me, that's the spirit of the university, is challenging ideas that you already have. The thing is, can you shield people from those ideas? Am I supposed to comfort them and make sure that they are insulated away from this? Like, is that what the point of this is? Because to me, that is so against what a university is about. So against it. I was not taking sides. I was presenting both arguments.
Okay. So the thing is about this is, if you're presenting something like this, you have to think about the kind of teaching climate that you're creating. And this is actually, these arguments are counter to the Canadian Human Rights Code. Ever since, and I know that you talked about C-16, ever since this passed, it is discriminatory to be targeting someone due to their gender identity or gender expression. So bringing something like that up in class, not critically, and I understand that you're trying to
It was critical. I introduced it critically.
How so? Like
I said, it was in the spirit of debate.
Okay, in the spirit of the debate is slightly different than being like, okay, this is like a problematic idea that we want to unpack.
But that's taking sides.
Yes.
Like, it's taking sides for me to be like, oh, look at this guy. Like, everything that comes out of his mouth is BS, but we're going to watch anyway.
Okay. So I understand the position that you're coming from and your positionality, but the reality is that it has created a toxic climate for some of the students.
How many?
It's great that...
Ooh, like how many?
Okay.
One?
May I speak? It is one or multiple students who've come forward saying that this is something that they were concerned about and that it made them uncomfortable. You're perfectly welcome to your own opinions, but when you're bringing it into the context of the classroom, that can become problematic. And that can become something that creates an unsafe learning environment for students.
But when they leave the university, they're going to be exposed to these ideas. So I don't see how I'm doing a disservice to the class by exposing them to ideas that are really out there. And I'm sorry I'm crying. I'm stressed out because this to me is so wrong. It's so wrong.
Can I mention the gendered violence, gendered and sexual violence policy?
Yeah, please.
So under that, it does, gendered violence doesn't just include sexual violence, but it also includes targeting folks based on gender. So that includes transphobia, biphobia, homophobia. All those sorts of things are protected under the policy, and so those are things that Laurier has upheld as values, as well as the Ontario Human Rights Code. And so those are things that we're responsible for not impacting our students in that way, and not spreading transphobia in that way.
Okay, so what I have a problem with is I didn't target anybody. Who did I target?
Trans folks.
How? By telling them ideas that are really out there? By telling them that? By telling them? Really?
It's not just telling them, in legitimizing this as a valid perspective, as this is another valid perspective.
In a university, all perspectives are valid.
That's not necessarily true, Lindsay.
Well, this is something that's being debated in current society, and I don't feel the need to shield people from what's going on in society. Like, to imagine that this is happening in university, it's just bad. Look, the thing is, like, I don't see what's transphobic about showing a video of Jordan Peterson. He's a real person. He's out there.
He is a real person, but he is a real person who has engaged in targeted behavior that, or targeting of trans students in a particular, like basically doxing them, if you know the term, like giving out their personal information so that they will be attacked, harassed, so that death threats will find them. This is something that he has done to his own students. He has done to other students. And this is also something that the students are aware of. So this is basically like playing, not to kind of do the thing where everything is kind of compared to Hitler, but this is like neutrally playing a speech by Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos from Gamergate. This is the kind of thing that departmentally, in terms of like critical communication studies and in terms of the course of what we're trying to do, is diametrically opposed to everything that we've been talking about in the lectures.
Hats off to that one. Really got to give it to you. Lindsay Shepherd, you got a good head on your shoulders. Props to you for sticking it in there, laying down your ground. As for the man relating Jordan Peterson to Hitler, this would be funny if it didn't have real-world implications. Peterson is a prominent social figure who has a large following and a lot of public support. The ideas he is challenging and the debates he is having are being heard in the public sphere. When you start sheltering students from experiencing the realities of society to create a space where none of their ideas are challenged, you create a generation of people who are unable to mentally cope with the world around them. These professors have been stuck in an echo chamber, some of them upwards of 20 years. They're in their own reality. If you think that they can prepare you for the real world, you're sadly mistaken. In light of all that, I'm going to leave you with Jordan Peterson's response to being compared to Hitler.
This is something to really pay attention to. Told her that by showing the video to her Canadian Communication in Context class, it was basically like neutrally playing a speech by Hitler. I don't know what to say about that, really. You know, although I don't find it amusing, and I don't take any pleasure in its satiric irony, you know, because it'd be easy to mock it, you know, but it's too serious to mock. It's not amusing. It's not the least bit amusing. It's so hyperbolic that it actually delegitimizes the horror that people feel for a figure as absolutely reprehensible as Adolf Hitler. You don't use that sort of thing casually. You don't use the name of someone who caused the death of millions of people in the most brutal possible manner as a casual insult to fortify your belief in your ideological purity and your moral virtue. As far as I'm concerned, the only way you can describe that sort of thing is as a sin. It's not acceptable. It's as simple as that.
Well, if you like what you saw, why don't you go ahead and sub? It's free. You can follow me on Twitter at MainCoon. I've also been live streaming some gameplay with my brothers here at twitch.com/theelderberries. Got a Patreon if you feel like hooking a brother up. Also, let me know how you feel about this. You know I like to keep the debate going on this channel. So, until next time, be your own hero, kids.